Welcome again. I am Arathi Raval. In this presentation, we will talk about Financial Action Task Force FATF's recommendation number 21 and learn about sanctions. We will have a higher level overview of risks that arises when operating in a foreign jurisdiction. In recent times, financial institutions have obligation to look into their jurisdictional risk and take measures to mitigate this risk. Jurisdictional risk is generally believed to be higher in the countries that have either been designated as non-cooperative by Financial Action Task Force or the jurisdictions determined to be of primary money laundering concern or has been identified for supporting international terrorism. In addition to this, countries or designated individuals or entities on whom sanctions are imposed are considered to be higher AML risk. In accordance with the Recommendation 21, the Financial Action Task Force recommends that financial institutions give special attention to business relations and transactions with persons, including companies and financial institutions from the non-cooperative countries and territories, shortly called NCCT. And in doing so, take into account issues raised in the relevant summaries of the annual NCCT report and any progress made by these jurisdictions since being listed as an NCCT. The FATF itself does not determine what specific measures financial institutions must take. It is up to each country to issue its own specific guidelines or regulations with which financial institutions must comply. Financial institutions must be extra careful in dealing with jurisdictions subject to special measures such as sanctions or embargoes imposed by authorized international bodies such as United Nations. In addition, in some circumstances, countries subject to sanctions or measures similar to those imposed by bodies such as UN, which may not be universally recognized, may be categorized as high risk by an institution because of the standing of the issuer and the nature of the measures. Countries may be flagged high in money laundering and terrorism risk if identified by well-known bodies that are generally regarded as reputable and that make such information publicly and widely available. Such sources may include, but not limited to, supranational or international bodies such as World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Units, as well as other relevant national governmental bodies and some non-governmental organizations. The 40 recommendations of Financial Action Task Force FATF are the international standards for effective anti-money laundering measures. Through periodic mutual evaluations, the FATF reviews its members' compliance with those 40 recommendations as well as the 9 special recommendations on terrorist financing, and suggests area for improvement as necessary. The FATF also identifies emerging trends and methods used to launder money and suggests measures to combat them. The goal of the initiative had been to secure the adoption by all financial centers of international standards to prevent, detect, and punish money laundering, and thereby effectively cooperate internationally in the global fight against money laundering. The FATF recommended that financial institutions give special attention to transactions involving the non-cooperative countries and territories in accordance with recommendation number 21. As mentioned earlier, Financial Action Task Force (FATF) periodically evaluates a country for its AML competency. The collected data from a country involve gathering the relevant information, including laws and regulations, as well as any mutual evaluation reports, related progress reports, and self-assessment surveys. FATF had a practice of naming and shaming countries that it determined maintained inadequate anti-money laundering controls and did not cooperate the global money laundering efforts. The broader criteria included countries with no or inadequate regulations and supervision of financial institutions. Also to mention, inadequate rules for licensing and creation of financial institutions, including assessing the backgrounds of the managers and beneficial owners. Inadequate customer identification requirements for financial institutions, excessive secrecy provisions regarding financial institutions, lack of efficient suspicious transaction reporting system, obstacles to international cooperation by administrative authorities, lack of resources in public and private sectors, and absence of financial intelligence units or an equivalent mechanism. The countries that lacks AML regulations drastically and shows no sign of improvement in exercising sufficient control are then listed on an NCCT, that is a non-cooperative countries list. Between 2000 and 2006, the FATF conducted the process of non-cooperative countries and territories list, NCCTs. During this process, 23 jurisdictions were listed due to lack of an effective AML CFT system. The process was highly successful. All of the 23 jurisdictions that had been identified as NCCTs in 2000 and 2001 made significant progress, and the last country was removed from the list in October 2006. In 2009, the leaders of G20 specifically called on the FATF to strengthen its process for assessing countries' compliance with international AML CFT standards and to publicly identify high-risk jurisdictions by February 2010. This call reinforced the revision process already underway with the FATF and led to the FATF's adoption in June 2009 of new International Country Risk Guide (ICRG) procedures. Since that time, the G20 has called for the continuation of FATF efforts to fight against money laundering and terrorist financing and to regularly update the public list of jurisdictions with strategic deficiencies. The February 2011 public statement reaffirmed the FATF's February 25, 2009 public statement that called on its members and other jurisdictions to apply effective countermeasures to protect their financial sectors from money laundering and terrorist financing risks arising from Iran and Democratic People's Republic of Korea. As of June 2011, FATF is still not satisfied with the progress in action plan by 11 countries. These 11 jurisdictions are Angola, Bolivia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Myanmar, Nepal, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Syria, Trinidad and Tobago, also Turkey. As a measure of counteraction, FATF will identify these jurisdictions as being out of compliance with the agreed action plans and will take actions. Sanctions are restrictive measures adopted mostly by international bodies such as United Nations, European Union, World Trade Organization against countries or individual persons, groups, legal entities, bodies, etc. The extent of the restriction varies, but the restrictions most often encompass a weapons embargo, entry ban, and imposition of freezing of funds and economic resources. In some cases, sanctions also involve a ban on import and export of other products than weapons. The UN Security Council adopts resolution on sanctions, and the European Union passes regulation on sanctions where a country or a person persistently violates international conventions and agreements, for instance, human rights. Generally, economic sanctions might be defined as mandatory economic measures taken against one or more countries to force a change in policies or at least to demonstrate a country's opinion about others' policies. The most often quoted study on sanctions defines the term sanction as the deliberate, government-inspired withdrawal or threat of withdrawal of customary trade or financial relations. Economic sanctions typically include measures such as trade embargoes, restrictions on particular exports or imports, denial of foreign assistance, loans and investments, or control of foreign assets and economic transactions related to the sanctioned country. Financial sanctions are restrictions on free access by designated individuals or entities to any funds and economic resources owned or controlled by physical or legal persons, groups, or entities in a country. All funds and economic resources must be frozen. No financial funds or economic resources may be made available to designated persons or entities. Neither may financial services be supplied to designated persons or entities. Trade sanction is a trade penalty imposed by one nation onto one or more other nations. Sanctions can be unilateral, imposed by only one country on another country, or multilateral, imposed by one or more countries on a number of different countries. Import tariffs, licensing costs, administrative hurdles are often enforced, making it more difficult, if not impossible, for the nations bearing the sanction to trade with nations imposing it. An example of trade sanction is a set of stringent penalties of United States imposed against Cuba from 1963 to 2000. In the year 2000, some of the sanctions were repealed, specifically those on medical and agricultural goods. Broad sanctions are complete prohibition of financial or economical relation with other country in order to induce the country's leaders to change their policies. Even if exemptions could be made, these broad sanctions often had an impact on the civilian population. Whereas targeted sanctions are directed against a specific product, a country's leadership, an organization, or individual rather than a country in general. In this way, it is easier to prevent the sanctions having an adverse impact on the civil population, while the sanctions send clearer signals to those who are intended to be influenced. With increasing focus on terrorist financing and multilateral restrictions, sanction compliance has become a major high-profile issue. Financial institutions should have proper procedures for client acceptance and ongoing monitoring. All new clients should be screened against sanction lists. Financial institutions are also required to check their existing clients against new names added to the sanction lists. Financial institutions should be vigilant to ensure that updates to the client's records should not result in holding accounts of sanctioned individual or entity. Updates of clients' records should be screened against sanction lists. In addition to the client's records, financial institutions should monitor their transactions, specifically payments to and from sanctioned individuals or entities, or to and from sanctioned countries, and block these transactions where necessary. Central repository of sanction lists should be updated frequently. There should be documented procedures on evidence standard for discounting potential matches and proper escalation processes. Paper payments, letters of credits, and manual payments need special monitoring. It is important for financial institutions operating on an international level to ensure they already have the process in place to avoid transactions that will put them in a risk of non-compliance with sanctioned legislation. Failure to do so has huge potential financial and reputational consequences. A preemptive approach is the better option. In addition to the above, financial institutions should have procedures to comply with any information request from government agencies or other parties involved in the transaction chain in a timely manner, and have appropriate levels of senior management oversight and approval of any policy or procedures that are implemented as a result of these guidelines. Sanctions compliance has been gaining increasing attention among financial services. Financial institutions face challenge to cope up with the expanding lists of sanctions and multiplying complexities of sanctions. Moreover, the inconsistent nature of global sanctions regimes and increasing expectations by different regulators worldwide are causing additional problems, especially where the requirements conflict. The biggest sanctions difficulty cited is the complexity of screening all dimensions of financial transactions. Even something as basic as client's name causes challenges. Inconsistent methods of translation of Arabic names, for example, make compliance more complicated. Some degree of flexibility and vague logic is needed to allow for nearest match, but the degree is judgmental call.